Agave Utahensis' life cycle is really poetic and beautiful and interesting. It's monocarpic, right? So it only flowers once in its entire life and then it dies. It spends decades growing, storing energy to produce this giant flower stalk in a single season that can grow up to 6 inches in one day. And then it flowers, it produces these, huge amounts of yellow flowers, and then it dies, and that's it. And I find that really poetic and beautiful and interesting. In fact, that's why my tagline here for Mojave.lv is going out in style. So that's what we're talking about in this week's YouTube video, Agave Utahensis' monocarpic lifestyle. So the fact that Agave Utahensis is monocarpic is actually one of my favorite traits about the plant. I just think it's super poetic and really interesting from a botanical and scientific point of view. And in fact, if you've ever been on my Instagram or you've watched these videos before, you'll probably notice that like my tagline that I use for Mojave.lv is going out in style. And one of the things that references is the fact that Agave Utahensis has this really dramatic monocarpic life cycle where it flowers once in its entire life and then dies. Very dramatically, like I said, very poetically and very interesting from a scientific point of view. And so the first thing we're going to talk about is that monocarpic life cycle, right? And the first thing to understand about Agave Utahensis and the fact that it's monocarpic is the time it takes from a plant, either from when it germinated from a seed or when it started life as a offshoot, vegetative propagation, which we're going to talk about a little bit later in this video. But how long a plant grows, an Agave Utahensis plant grows from a very small immature plant all the way up until the time that it flowers. And I refer to this as time to flower. Now, most agaves, I believe, are monocarpic, right? They almost all flower once in their life and then die, but they all have different time to flowers, right? And time to flower, that is the number of years that it takes for an agave plant to flower, can vary even within species, right? The agaves that are used to make tequila have a very short, relatively speaking, for an agave species time to flower, only a few years, 7 years, 5 years, something like that, under 10 years in many cases. And then there are some agave species that are very closely related to Agave Utahensis, like Agave deserti, that actually has been shown in some studies to have a very, very long time to flower. And in fact, I think there's one case where the average time to flower for plants in habitat in one study was found to be something like 50 years. And so if you ask, and I've asked a number of Agave Utahensis experts what their estimation is on Agave Utahensis' average time to flower, and the answers are really, really varied, and for good reason, right? Generally the range you'll get is from 10 to 20 years, but there's a lot of caveats with that. There's a lot of sort of catches in that range, which even 10 to 20 years is a pretty big range. One of the biggest caveats, one of the biggest factors, when you ask how long does it take an Agave Utahensis to flower, the first thing you have to understand is, are you asking about a plant in cultivation or are you asking about a plant in habitat? Because in cultivation, generally speaking, Agave Utahensis is going to be really well watered. It's going to be protected from the harshest sun, or it's going to be properly acclimated to the amount of sun and UV stress that it's getting. And it might even be fertilized. It might even be given macro and micronutrients. And so generally speaking, that will speed up the time to flower. So plants in cultivation that are very well cared for, that have very fast growth rates because they've been very well cared for with water and nutrients and proper lighting exposure and proper temperatures and all that stuff, generally will have faster growth rates and thus will flower at a younger age, will have a lower time to flower. On the other side of that coin, plants in cultivation, in many cases, particularly if they are cultivated in containers, will have their offsets, their pups taken away and then propagated into new plants. And while I haven't seen a whole lot of actual scientific, studies to back up this idea, I do believe that. We'll talk a little bit more about vegetative propagation, like I said, later in the video, but I do believe that one of the triggers that tells an Agave Utahensis plant to flower is the presence of offsets, is the fact that it has vegetatively propagated. So there may be some delaying effect to be had by removing offsets, right? I've heard some stories of plants in cultivation that have been very well cared for, very well watered, all that kind of stuff, that are very mature looking, but have had the pups removed basically as soon as they're, old enough, big enough to be removed, and those plants still haven't flowered. But there are some, anecdotal references of plants in cultivation flowering, at the 10, 15, 20 year mark. Now, if you're talking about a plant in habitat and asking how long does an Agave Utahensis plant in habitat take to flower, that's an even wider range, right? So like I said, there was at least one study of Agave deserti, which is a different but related species of agave, that found that the average time to flower of that species in habitat in the study was like 50 years. A lot of that has to do with water, how much water the plant's getting, what the soil conditions are like, what the temperature is like. And like I said, I do also think that there is a lot to do with vegetative propagation, i.e. if the plant has produced a whole bunch of pups, I think it's more likely to flower. And so in habitat, we can probably safely assume that the average time to flower, again, is a very wide range because it has a lot to do with environmental characteristics, environmental conditions, but it's probably closer, at least in my opinion, probably closer to the higher end of that 10 to 20 year range, probably 20 years, maybe even more in some cases, 25, 30 years. Again, because, deserti, it could be up to 50 years. So I do think that Agave Utahensis in habitat is probably more closer to the 20-year part end of that 10 to 15 year time to flower range. But when discussing when Agave Utahensis decides to flower, we have to talk about something called auxins. Auxins are basically plant hormones or signaling chemicals used by a plant to trigger various responses. And most Agave Utahensis experts believe that flowering in Agave Utahensis is triggered by auxins. And studies on other forms of agave, and again, some anecdotal research, my own observations, going out in habitat and then talking to other experts, moisture availability is probably one of the most biggest triggers, environmental triggers, that will signal that the auxins to force the plant to flower should begin. And that makes sense, right? One of the reasons, evolutionarily speaking, that monocarpic plants have an advantage in arid desert environments with low moisture availability is that the flowering process is very moisture intensive. It takes a lot of water and a lot of nutrients and a lot of other stuff, but mostly a lot of water to produce that huge flower stalk. And we're going to talk about how big those flower stalks are and how fast they grow, but it takes a lot of water to produce the big giant flower stalks that Agave Utahensis produces. It takes a lot of moisture to produce all the nectar that Agave Utahensis produces to attract the pollinators that we're also going to talk about later in this video. Most environments that Agave Utahensis grows in probably don't have the amount of moisture required for that flowering process available every single year. And so Agave Utahensis, and like other monocarpic plants, can kind of, hedge its bets, can kind of pick and choose the best possible years to flower, the years in which not only will it have the best chance of having the amount of moisture that it needs to produce the stalk, but that there might also be the right amount of moisture in the environment for the seeds that it produces to have the best chance at germinating. So moisture availability is a big trigger, I think, for Agave Utahensis. It's shown to have an effect on other forms of agave, and I don't know if there's been any studies done specifically on Agave Utahensis, but I do think it stands to reason that water is a big trigger for moisture availability. Having a really wet, season before flowering, summer, fall, and winter before flowering, and then moisture in the springtime when the plant does begin to flower. And so that life cycle of flowering begins basically in the springtime, something like March, April, May, depending on the elevation of the plant, actually. Plants that are lower down in lower elevation, like a lot of places, Ibora spina, starts to flower earlier in the year because at lower elevation, it's warmer earlier in the year. It starts to get pretty warm or even hot in some lower elevation places, at only 4,000 feet here in the Mojave in March, whereas plants like Nevadensis plants that are growing up above 6,000 feet, it's still pretty cold in March, so they might not start to actually begin the flowering process until April. But generally sometime in the springtime, the center of the plant starts to kind of develop a peak, if you will. The leaves in the center of the plant, it just sort of looks like the leaves are kind of coming to a point at the center of the plant in a way that you generally don't see in plants not about to flower. And in fact, I went and I saw it in Agave Utahensis Spina plant, a very famous one, it was my first time visiting it, and it looks like it was about to start to flower because it started developing that peak in the center of the rosette. But the timing on that one was a little off. It was going to do what I call late flowering, which again we'll talk about later in the video. But so sometime in the early spring, the center of the plant will start to develop a peak in the middle of the rosette. And then as spring continues, a shoot, which looks like an asparagus, actually, and I believe agave is closely related, the genus agave is closely related to asparagus. But in the fall, a small shoot appears in the middle from that peak and starts to grow. A lot of times that shoot, particularly early in the spring, that's very new plant tissue. So the UV stress that it's under at that time is great because it hasn't acclimated to UV stress. It's a new part of the plant. So a lot of times those shoots are actually purple when they first start to grow, which is the result of UV stress and the compounds produced by the plant to counteract that UV stress. And then throughout the springtime, once that flowering starts, once that flower stalk starts to grow, it actually grows at a really, really incredible rate. I have some in my backyard. I've had them for a couple of different seasons now. I've had multiple flowering plants for a few seasons now, and that's where like the seeds that I sell sometimes on my website, mojave.lv, come from. They come from hand-pollinated plants in my collection, but I've actually been able to measure those plants and track their growth rate, and they grow up to 6 inches in a single day. Like you can almost quite literally watch an Agave Utahensis flower stalk grow. Like you can just sit there and see it grow. 6 inches in a day is a crazy amount of growth, particularly for Agave Utahensis, which otherwise is a very, very slow growing plant. So it's a really dramatic process. And again, it looks like a purple asparagus basically at first. Over the course of the season, it does turn yellow, or most of them turn green. And that inflorescence is just a fancy word for flower. And that flower structure, and we've talked about this a bunch on the channel before, but it can basically have one of 3 different types of structures, right? So there's the central flower stalk that shoots up, and it can either produce a flower stalk that is spigot, that is where the flowers come directly off that central flower stalk. It can be racemic, where that flower stalk grows and then there are single appendages from which 2 or more flowers will branch off of. Or it can be paniculate, which is the most complex kind, where the flower stalk grows up and then there are sort of branches or appendages from that flower stalk, and then each one of those then branches itself and produces multiple flowers from that. The three of the taxa of Agave Utahensis, regular, degular, subspecies Utahensis, and then varieties Nevadaensis and Spina, can all produce variable inflorescences. And we talked about what that means for the sort of evolutionary history of Agave Utahensis, that those are then probably the result of a relatively recent field hybridization, and Cababensis only produces paniculate inflorescences, so it's probably older. It's probably the oldest form evolutionarily speaking, but yeah, so it produces one of 3 types of inflorescences, one of those 3 structures. And then as the spring gets later and the summer begins, that flower stalk, which is now grown to 6, 8, sometimes 10 or even 12 feet tall, depending on the size of the rosette. It does seem to be to me that larger rosettes produce larger flower stalks. And in habitat, you'll sometimes see these like really, really thick flower stalks. They look like, tree branches almost, tree stumps, tree trunks, growing from really huge, really mature rosettes. But as that grows up, once it reaches its full height, the buds start to sort of unfurl from the flower stalk, and they produce copious amounts of bright yellow flowers. And those bright yellow flowers they're perfect flowers. Each individual flower contains both the male and female parts of the flower. They produce both pollen, and then there's an ovary there that gets pollinated. I believe that Agave Utahensis is generally an obligate outcrosser. That is, it doesn't prefer to pollinate itself, and if it can pollinate itself, it's probably going to produce lower amounts of seeds, and so there are a ton of pollinators that get attracted to these copious and super bright yellow flowers. And in fact, like I said, there's been a few seasons now where I've had a bunch of flowering plants in my backyard, and it turns my backyard into like a nature show that my little daughter and I love to sit out and watch, because it brings hummingbirds and a whole bunch of different kinds of, bees and all sorts of things. Apparently in the wild, in habitat, bats are a primary pollinator of Agave Utahensis. But in either case, it produced copious amounts of yellow flowers in the summer, and those flowers each produce copious amounts of nectar that attract a ton of, just a ton of pollinators. And even sometimes in habitat, you can see all sorts of bugs, like non-pollinating bugs, like bugs that eat the plants. And you'll see they do, some flower stalks will be covered in them sometimes, and then other flower stalks you can actually see that there's been damage to a flower stalk done by those essentially pest insects out in habitat. So then, as the summer continues, the flowers open up bright yellow. They produce pollen. Whatever pollination happens, again, in the plants that I have in my backyard every season, I hand pollinate them. Just to make sure that there is enough cross-pollination, even though, again, there are a ton of pollinators back there when that happens. And then the fall starts to arrive, and as late summer happens, again, they grow in the Mojave where it's very hot and very dry, particularly in the summer. Those flowers dry up and sort of die and turn brown, and this whole time, the rosette at the bottom of the flower stalk has gone from, it might be a blue Nevadensis plant or a greenish Eborospina plant, but either way, it's started to sort of look like, leaves in the fall, in that it starts to turn yellow. And at first, it's a very dramatic, bright yellow, almost bright neon yellow and orange. As the leaves, again, because it's monocarpic, that flowering process means that the plant is going to die. That the leaves are starting to dry up, and that process, particularly in the late spring and into the summer, is really dramatic, really cool looking. The colors are really vibrant, and then generally by the fall, that deep neon yellow has turned more of a pale yellow, and the leaves have become completely dry. Because again, what agave is doing during that process is it's converting all the stored fructans, all the stored carbohydrates, all the energy that the plant has gathered through photosynthesis and through the moisture that it's had throughout its life and through the decades that it's been alive. It's converting all of those fructans, which is a complex carbohydrate that it's stored in the rosette of the plant, and it's converted them into simple sugars and used those simple sugars to power this vertical growth, this giant flower stalk that it grows, and then all the nectar that comes off of that. And in fact, when indigenous folks harvested Agave Utahensis to roast and to eat, they would do so just after flowering had begun, just when the stalk was beginning to, they say about hip height, which means you've only got a few days to time that correctly, because once the flowering has begun, the complex carbohydrates, which aren't really great, they're mostly indigestible to humans. But if you harvest an Agave Utahensis too early, you're really not getting a whole lot of sugar, a lot of carbohydrates, a lot of nutrition out of the plant, because again, they're fructans, they're indigestible. But once flowering begins, all those fructans have then converted into sugar, and a simple sugar, so the plant becomes very sweet. But if you wait too long, all those sugars will be used in the flowering process. So it is generally in the sort of late spring, mid-late spring when harvesting happened. But I have a whole bunch more videos coming about indigenous use of Agave Utahensis on this channel in the future. So in the fall time, the rosette has dried up, the leaves or the flowers on the flower stalk have dried up, and then the parts of the plant that have been pollinated below the flowers will start to turn into seed pods. And again, as fall goes on further, those seed pods will turn from greenish to brownish and will start to dry up, and that's when the seeds, eventually the seed pods will open up, will sort of crack open, and the seeds, which are very small, very light, little black seeds, little triangle looking black seeds, will start to be dispersed generally by the wind. It's very easy if you walk up to an Agave Utahensis flower stalk in the wild and you kind of shake it, a whole bunch of seeds, if there's any seeds left in the seed pod, will fall out. And there are a ton of seeds that each one of these stalks produces, right? That's one of the benefits of monocarpic flowering, is that because it's saved up so much of this energy and it's picked in the right season to flower, it can produce a ton, absolute massive quantities of seeds. And in fact, each one of those tiny little seed pods can hold 25, 50, I think maybe even 100 seeds in some cases. And there are hundreds potentially on bigger flower stalks of these seed pods. So each flowering Agave Utahensis plant can produce thousands and thousands of seeds. So when you go out into the wild and you see a big clump and it's got 4 or 5 different flower stalks on it with all the seed pods on it, you're looking at many thousands, maybe tens of thousands of seeds that have been produced by that plant. And again, I think that's one of the benefits of monocarpic reproduction, in that the volume of seeds, just the number of seeds, the quantity of seeds is really, really high. And there are a couple of variations that sometimes happen in that process that I think are notable. One, and we've talked about this in this channel before, is something I call aux stalks or auxiliary stalks. I also call them aux stalks because, remember, it's related to auxin production. But basically, because Agave Utahensis produces a lot of offsets, and then the actual flowering process in the mature plant is triggered by auxins. If there are offsets on the bottom of the plant, in a lot of cases you won't even be able to see these offsets. They'll be tiny, either covered by the mature rosette or still underground. If those are still connected to the root system, and the mature plant starts producing a bunch of auxins saying, hey, it's time to flower, let's flower. Sometimes those unseen, still underground offsets can be triggered into flowering, but they're tiny, and so they produce these very strange, very small, sort of atrophied looking auxiliary stalks, essentially, right? And I'll cut in some video here of a few different examples, but in a lot of cases, basically it looks like there is a very tiny auxiliary stalk coming from the bottom of the plant. In some cases, it looks like the mature plant is still alive, like somehow the offsets got triggered into flowering, but the main plant didn't get triggered into flowering. And those aux stalks will eventually actually produce seed pods and what look like viable seeds. I'm not 100% sure if they are actually viable. I don't see any reason why they would not be. But that's everybody's best guess as to what these auxiliary stalks, these little smaller stalks, and that generally happens around the same time that the main stalks form, is sort of in the springtime when the main stalk would start to form. But what doesn't happen sometimes at the same time is something I call late flowering. I mean, late flowering is not some grand term that I invented, but I have seen a number of examples in habitat where as temperatures start to cool down, like they are sort of right now, as we get into fall, plants will also start to flower. And it won't be as many plants as started to flower in the springtime. I've only seen one here or there, not generally a huge field of them starting to flower. And I think this is generally a problem because, again, I believe that Agave Utahensis is an obligate outcrosser, and so flowering later in the season when there aren't many other Agave Utahensis plants around that are also flowering means that there will be less pollen from other plants available to pollinate those late flowers. And again, that Agave Utahensis Iborispina, that famous one that I posted with the really merged spines that looked like it was beginning to flower, was doing so much, much later than any of the other plants that were flowering in its habitat that season. I haven't been back to visit it. I will be over the next couple of months going back to visit and see if it actually did start flowering, but hopefully it did not. Hopefully it will at least wait till next spring when it can flower and then have a bunch of other pollen available to it via the pollinators, to come and to pollinate it. And like we talked about, again, the pollinators, like I said, here in my backyard, my flowering plants attract, just tons. Bees, all sorts of flying, different things. I'm not a bug guy, so I don't really know which bees, wasps, hornets, whatever, but a whole bunch of flying things that look like they might sting you if you got them mad at you. And then a bunch of hummingbirds, right? And I live in the suburbs, so it's not like I live, real close to the wilderness or anything, and a bunch of hummingbirds came to my backyard as well. But in habitat, I believe bats are the primary pollinator of Agave Utahensis, so it's primarily bats that you see. And I most of the time I go out during the day, so I don't see a whole lot of bats, although I may make some trips next spring at night so that I can try to see if I can capture some video of bats pollinating Agave Utahensis flower stalks. And then the other thing that we talked about a little bit is vegetative propagation. So Agave Utahensis, as we know, is monocarpic, right? So it's only going to flower once and then it's going to die. That's the only time that it's going to reproduce sexually. It's the only time it's going to produce new genetic material. It's the only time it's going to produce seed, is that once in a lifetime monocarpic flowering process. But it does also reproduce. There are two other ways that agave species in general also reproduce. One of those ways, and that Agave Utahensis does very, very frequently, is vegetative propagation. Basically, it produces offsets or pups from its root system. And so when you go out into habitat, it's very, very rare that you see a mature Agave Utahensis plant that doesn't have a bunch of offsets around its base. And in fact, it's much more common to see clumps, where it's 4, 5, 6, however many more, multiple Agave Utahensis plants, all that are, offsets of each other, clones of each other. And then in a lot of cases, they then end up producing these big, giant clonal rings, which again, I have a ton of content coming on this channel in the future about Agave Utahensis clonal rings, because I think they're super duper interesting. But it's important to understand that Agave Utahensis is going to reproduce more than just through seeds. It's going to reproduce more than once, most plants, more than once in its lifetime, primarily through propagation, vegetative propagation. And that's important because, while I did say that each one of those stalks is going to produce thousands of seeds, Agave Utahensis habitat is a very brutal place. And the vast, vast majority, it's going to be a tiny, tiny fraction of those seeds are ever actually going to germinate, that they're ever going to land in a place that isn't just on top of a limestone boulder, that they're going to land in some place where they have a little bit of shade, where the right moisture, the timing on the moisture, like there's going to be a rainstorm or something like that in the springtime. So such a tiny fraction of the seeds actually produced by an Agave Utahensis plant are going to germinate in the wild, means that most plants that you see out in the wild are actually not seed grown. They are clones of other plants. They are vegetatively propagated. Now, in cultivation, Agave Utahensis seeds can easily have 80, 90, even 100% germination rate from seed, but in habitat, that number is going to be way, way lower. The third way that other forms of agave reproduce commonly is through the production of what are called bulbils, essentially. Other species of agave, other than Agave Utahensis, will produce small, basically offsets, little pups, little small, partially grown plants without root systems, of course, on those flower stalks, right? And so sometimes you'll see a single giant flower stalk just covered with hundreds and hundreds of small little bulbils, basically, and those can be just pulled off and planted, and they will sprout roots and grow. Agave Utahensis does this very, very infrequently, and in my experience, what I've seen in habitat, it appears that Agave Utahensis generally only does that when the flower stalk has been damaged. Either some animal came by and ate it, the wind broke it, blew it over, something like that. Then you will see rarely an Agave Utahensis flower stalk covered or with a bulbil on it. Generally, they're not covered in bulbils in the same way that other species do, but you'll see it with 1, 2, or 3 or something in that range kind of numbers of bulbils. I've only seen this a handful of times. I've seen thousands, probably tens of thousands of flower stalks out in the wild, many of them damaged that did not produce bulbils, but I've seen a handful that looked like they had been damaged at some point during the flowering season and resorted to producing bulbils because they weren't going to be able to produce flowers. So I'd love to hear from you down in the comments. Do you think, like I do, that Agave Utahensis' monocarpic flower once and die life cycle is as poetic and beautiful and as interesting as I do? What's your favorite little fact about it? And thanks for watching.